Okay. Good afternoon, viewers, and good afternoon to my panelists, and welcome. This is a panel discussion on racial equity. I'm State Senator Barbara Favola, and I have pulled this panel together to facilitate a community conversation on an issue that's very important to everyone, and an effort to build a more inclusive community. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments, you viewers, and I'm sure you will enjoy the insights of our panelists. And I'm very proud they're an esteemed body, and I will take a moment now to introduce them. We have Gil Bland with us, Gil Bland rather, and Gil is the president and CEO of the Urban League of Hampton Roads. Gil also, he's an entrepreneur, and he's CEO of the Giljoy Group, which is an entrepreneurial firm working in the restaurant industry. Gil chairs the Virginia African American Advisory Board, and that's a statewide board. And he also was on the executive committee of the Virginia Chamber of Commerce and the Virginia Complete Count Commission. So thank you, Gil, for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
You're welcome. Also with us is somebody that many of you know, Shirley Ginwright. Wright. Shirley is from Fairfax, and Shirley actually chairs the Fairfax County Communities of Trust Committee. And this was established in 2014, shortly after the terrible incident in Missouri. Actually, it was in the Ferguson, it's referred to as the Ferguson incident in Missouri. And Shirley had a meeting with our chairman of the Board of Supervisors and suggested that perhaps we need to take some steps up here in Fairfax to ensure that such an incident doesn't happen up here. And Shirley was just had the skill set, the personality, and the perseverance to pull together and chair a body that has been studying how we develop trust with our police units and with other institutions here in Fairfax. Ms. Ginwright, let me just go over her other responsibilities. You serve on the Commission for Diversity and Inclusion. Again, that's a Virginia Commission on Diversity and Inclusion, and you are a member of the Commonwealth African American Advisory Board. And you, of course, participate in many other activities. So thank you, Shirley.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Also with us is Jonathan Zerg. And Jonathan is president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. Welcome, Jonathan. Jonathan, you have tentacles in every part of the state. You are working with schools and businesses and other organizations to learn how to achieve success through inclusion. You were appointed by the governor to serve on the commission on the African American History and Education Commission. You're a member of the Virginia Complete Count Commission. And you're also on the Advisory Council of the Asian and Latino Solidarity Alliance of Central Virginia and the Program Evaluation Committee of the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation. So here you are with all the different parts of the state. Also joining us is Allison Lawrence. And Allison is, I will say she does communications and other things for the Senate Democratic Caucus. You do have a history with the Virginia Health and Hospital Associations. Allison has been involved in many issues that are incredibly important to addressing racial equality and equity in how we allocate our resources. It is a pleasure always working with you, Allison, and I am delighted you will be with us. Allison will be moderating the question and answer period of our program probably midway through. And our panelists will start off, if you don't mind, I'm going to give us all little themes to talk about because they were important themes. They're themes that came up as a result of speaking to many, many residents, experts, and those who really want to help us affect change. One of the common themes has been, how do we build trust with our institutions among all the various diverse groups that interact in our society, and in particular with our police units? Because if you don't have that trust, these institutions really cannot do their job. They cannot keep people safe. They cannot investigate crimes properly, especially if you're talking about the police unit. And there's a breakdown in our society. And certainly we don't have the values that we all honor and share if that trust is not there. So I don't know. I think I will start with you, Gil. So tell me what your recipe might be if we were to create a different environment for the way we police, and if we could create more trust. What would you tell us to do?
Well, thank you for the question. And I think I was sharing with some of you that earlier today I was on a committee meeting with Virginia African American Advisory Board to the governor with a conversation about public safety and these very issues. And it was enlightening because one of the committee members is the chief of police for the city of Norfolk. And I just think the public would have been very pleased to hear the kind of back and forth on some very tough issues of, the level of police enforcement, level of funding, whether or not they should have cameras, whether there should be military equipment used, a whole host of issues that, attempt to balance public safety with reasonableness, as well as with, good judgment and the oversight of the community that they are, enlisted to represent. And, I think there are a number of sample programs that may not be 100% there, but we can learn from. For example, Camden, New Jersey, their program where they brought in county police. There are some plus and minuses there, and Houston has done the same. And it seems to me that one of the real takeaways is that, on a particularly in the Commonwealth, if we were to look at test markets and attempt to do any number of best practices from across the country, it would be a good start. I do know that our police chief in the city of Norfolk is very open to all of this. And the other item I would suggest is that this gradual effort of that's turned to the police being the answer for everything, mental health issues, all types of areas where they may not necessarily have the best expertise, probably ought to be transitioned to other folks and funded differently. So those are my initial thoughts, but I think it will be a give and take and a experimenting here and there and taking best practices and hopefully establishing a template that can be used across the Commonwealth.
I hope so. Shirley, you've actually had to work with many community members to grapple with this issue. Perhaps you can give us some insights as to what Fairfax is doing to build trust, and maybe we can take those on the road.
Yeah, one of the things we did in establishing the Communities of Trust Committee was to make sure that we got community leaders, faith leaders, and citizens around the table to talk about the issues and how do we resolve these issues. And around this table include our law enforcement. And we're just completely open about what is going on. It's that transparency that we have to have, getting them, the community involved when you're rewriting policies. Because their input is important. So when you have a stake in what's being written, then it's more acceptable to the community. But the open discussions, the listening sessions that we've begun to have here in Fairfax is extremely important because sometimes we don't listen. We'll have these sessions and everyone's talking, but sometimes we have to step back, listen to what is being told to us, and then give our comments. But for us as communities of trust, what I've really seen, the community engagement, our law enforcement actually going out now into the community working with the younger kids, because we have to build that trust when they're much younger than 18, because some of the things that they see on television is the only thing that they know about police officers. So if they don't see them in a positive light, working within their community, you know, they'll never be able to trust them. So we're trying to go into the communities and actually have activities with the kids. With the teenagers, they play basketball. And those are some of the things that we have to do to actually get them to see the police officers as human, as a community member, as someone who lives in your neighborhood. And that this is their job, just as you chose to be a senator or an electrician. Sure. I chose the information technology field. They chose to be a police officer. It's a career field for them. And we have to appreciate and respect that. But respect for each other plays an important role in whatever we do in building this trust.
So you would say that community policing is a
huge part.
Is absolutely.
It's a huge part. And one of the things when President Obama came out with the task force of 21st century policing, yeah, and the recommendations of that, when his recommendations came out, Fairfax County, we had already implemented a lot of those before we had even seen them. But again, we had already established this committee to talk about what our issues were.
Wow, that's a great model. Jonathan?
You know, I would just add to her comment, you know, the whole notion of community, I think, you know, the operative word to me is trust. When the protest occurred in our region in Norfolk, and specifically after the George Floyd murder, our police chief actually marched along the streets with the protesters. And you know, it created a whole different reaction when they saw that everyone could understand wrong is wrong, and it doesn't matter, you know, you call a wrong, and that begins to build trust.
Yeah, that would be a very powerful statement. Very, very powerful. I wish we had more police chiefs who would be willing to stand up and do something like that. Jonathan, would you like to comment on the building of trust here and what you have seen throughout the Commonwealth?
Certainly, and thank you, Senator, for the opportunity. And I have such deep appreciation and respect for the others on the panel. So it's a joy to be with each of you. You know, I think a few things. One is, and it builds a little bit on what Shirley was just saying, one of the things I've said a lot these last few weeks is that a crisis is the worst time to try to start building trust. And so for folks who are for the first time saying, let me have a conversation with my neighbor of a different race about race. Or let me talk a teacher saying, before the end of the school year, I want to make sure my students know where I stand on race. Well, your students have been with you since September. And so if you have a foundation that is built on some sense of mutuality, of regard, it's reciprocal in terms of how folks are treating one another, then I'm much more likely to give someone the benefit of the doubt than if we don't have that foundation of trust, then we haven't built that at the beginning. I think the other piece that's really important about this moment, as I listen to those who are protesting on the front lines especially, is that when they're talking about trust, it goes deeper than just interpersonal relationships. So having a relationship with a law enforcement professional can be a positive step. And if the message that a young Black person in particular gets from this country is, you can be anything you want to be, just work hard, and then time and time and time again, that's not their lived experience in school, when their interactions with healthcare and their interactions with law enforcement, then why would they trust that the system would work for them? It's not actually, they're hearing one thing and they're experiencing something very different. And I think that's true in terms of how young people in particular have interacted with law enforcement, that they're hearing. These are folks present to serve and protect, and yet there are far too many examples of negative interactions. And conversely, I think that we have law enforcement professionals who are hearing, you're getting trained to protect folks, to help folks, and as Gil noted, they're now being asked to take on a significant number of roles far beyond the traditional job description. And so that also is a breakdown of trust. And so it goes beyond one-on-one relationships or small group relationships to actually thinking about how are our systems and structures even set up?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do when you look at it from a systemic perspective, a systemic lens. I know many communities, though, want to start building trust. And one of the strategies has been, gee, maybe we should set up a civilian review board when we're looking at allegations of abuse by police. I don't know if that's necessarily a magical wand, but it may be a useful tool if we have community buy-in. Does anybody want to comment on that strategy?
I support community oversight. I think, a term I always use in so many areas, it takes a village, and bringing in various opinions and oversight from the community is helpful.
Yeah.
I think it should be encouraged and frankly be a part of the process.
And this is Shirley. One of the things, again, here in Fairfax, we do have civilian review panel. I think you have more authority. Like, I don't think they have investigative power. So to enhance it, I think that would be a good thing. But I think it is something that we should have across the state. And it would reduce a lot of the tension that we have when something happens with our police officers and a community member. Because what they look at, the police department should not be investigating themselves. So this gives an opportunity where now you have another body that can look at the investigation. So personally, I think it's a good thing. I think it would help build the trust because you have a little more transparency now.
Right, yeah. Those are very good points, and I've got them noted, and we will certainly, I think there's going to be a legislative proposal around that civilian review board concept, when we go back for our special session. I expect we'll make some progress in the special session, but it'll just be the beginning. This will be a long road to really get to a place where our institutions look at their policies and allocate resources from an equity lens, and we truly achieve, the equality we're talking about.
And I think, if I can add on to that, I think for some of the larger jurisdictions, the civilian review panel board might be great. But I think when we look at some of the rural areas, we might need to look at maybe a civilian review board or a commission or whatever, but not at the same level. So I think as we write these policies, we have to look at the areas as well and to see what's going on within those areas.
And maybe we set the expectation that, any kind of abusive behavior by police is looked at regularly, so we don't get to a point where somebody has 28 allegations and is still policing.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I know, I understand that. Body cameras are also another tool that people are talking about. Have you had personal experience with jurisdictions using them? Do you have any advice on how we should shape the use of that tool? Shirley, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, we did a test at 3 of our stations using body-worn cameras, and now they are fully implemented. This year we were going to expand that program, but because of COVID-19, the funding got a little delayed. Yeah. But we do have approval to expand our body-worn camera program in all of Fairfax County Police Department. And I tell people it is not inexpensive. It's very expensive.
No, Arlington is going to do a bond question. Yeah.
Yes. So as we expand the program around the state, again, I think some funding is going to have to come from the state to help implement this program. But I think it is well worth having the cameras and a great policy, because you can't just have the body-worn cameras and then they can turn it on and off whenever they get ready. So we have to look at the policy, and maybe the policy should be standard around the state.
And Fairfax has a policy about when
Almost definitely. We had a policy before we began the body-worn camera. Even before our pilot program, we had a policy, and then we re-looked at that policy. So yes, there is a policy.
maybe you could send it to myself and
I can.
and Allison. That would certainly be very helpful.
I would add, Shirley and I were in a meeting today, and we had a very lengthy conversation about body cams, and it was clear that it was a preference of our committee to endorse that. But as Shirley said, the cost is prohibitive. So it was estimated that only 1/3 of the Commonwealth presently have body cameras, and even for those departments that have it, they have to ration them to largely patrolmen on the street and not some of their other areas of public safety. So I encourage you, Senator, to remember that we support this, and we hope that you support it with a budget initiative.
Well, we're going to try to put some resources behind these great tools. We know our local governments are suffering from COVID-19 expenses. The state is as well, but we did get some pass-through money from the federal government, and we will be looking at how we can fill some of those gaps with our federal dollars. But I will say that I, for one, believe this is a priority. So even if we, can not fully fund, but start funding around the state, that would be a good thing. So I'm hearing a lot of support for that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about a program in Houston, which I've been reading as much as I possibly can, and it's a diversion program. When calls come into 911, there's actually a dispatcher, as you know, and the dispatcher is trained to determine whether the call is really the results of an individual having a mental health crisis as opposed to conducting intentionally a crime. And the dispatcher can send out a social worker and an EMS official, and the police officer goes along mainly to ensure safety of the site, but the counselor is really, in charge of dealing with the alleged perpetrator, de-escalating the situation, and getting the person services. So it's really sort of removed from that, law and order track. I don't know if any of you know of examples like the Houston example going on in Virginia. I would certainly like to do a study on that so we can get it out to our communities. And would anybody like to comment? Jonathan, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, in Richmond, there's a lot of focus right now on a reform effort called a Marcus Alert, which would provide, I think, some important awareness and really does distinguish mental health experience and someone who is needing counseling support or mental health support as compared to someone who needs a law enforcement response. And I think more and more that's going to be the way in which the public policy needs to shift and needs to move, that we need to recognize that police are being asked to do too much. And if it's truly a community-facing response, then we need to meet the need of the person who's in crisis and not just respond to the one-size-fits-all. I think with all the strategies we're talking about, a civilian review board or cameras or this idea of a diversion program, a lot of the challenge is the devil's in the details. And so a civilian review board, how much power do they actually have and how much authority do they have? And who determines who's on a civilian review board? Because that can definitely break down some trust if it's not seen as being truly representative of the community. In the case of body cameras, I think where there are some privacy challenges that come up. So a lot of folks like the idea of body cameras until that officer's coming into your home with a camera and they're wanting some privacy. And so we need to figure out, there's a way in which over-policing certain communities could result then in those cameras being used in nefarious or hurtful ways, particularly to Black and brown folks and folks experiencing poverty, folks living in public housing, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then when we think about these diversion programs, I think that's a real opportunity, assuming that there is independence among the counselors and there is clear authority that they have. So if an officer is there and a counselor is there, who makes the decision about when it has gone from a mental health issue to a crime issue? That's going to be important to distinguish in order to make sure that the intent of these types of policies match the impact.
I think that's why I'm very motivated to shape a study on this, because I think we could gain so much, and the diversion aspect is really needed. And it would allow us to shift resources to, a counseling element of the whole protection that police are supposed to be providing.
Yeah. If I can add on to that, our police department and our sheriff department actually went down to Texas and to look at their program. And we have actually a diversion first program that's been in place, I think about 3, maybe 4 years now.
Yes.
And even within our police department, we have a critical intervention team. So if one of our officers take a call and they figure that the person is actually having a mental crisis, then they can call someone from that critical intervention team to come out and handle the situation. So it's sort of like they stand down and wait for someone to come. Then this person is not taken to jail, but taken over to the Merrifield Center where they can actually get help, as opposed to taking them to jail, which is what was happening before we had the Diversion First program. So and that program has been working well.
I was briefed on that program by Sheriff Kincaid.
Yes.
Yeah, and I actually observed the site and everything. I was very impressed. And that's another track other than the 911 dispatcher having the police officer be trained. Maybe we have to do a combination.
Yeah.
But yes, Fairfax does have a very effective program. But you also have some capacity in the community so the folks can get the treatment, which is another point we have to do some more funding for, is actually come up with the mental health treatment programs.
And actually,
she's off.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
This was something I was thinking about, the lack of counselors, especially as it relates to schools and our kids, as we have people who work in mental health, psychologists, psychiatrists, who retire, and we don't have the funding to put these kids in the schools or wherever we need them, the workers in the schools or maybe in a mental health center. So my thought was, why couldn't we ask them to volunteer some of their time, because everyone's not looking for a salary, and maybe we can give them a tax break. Then he's not taking any money out of anybody's pocket. But that would be something I think we should look into.
It's a great idea.
Now that I have your attention.
It's a great idea. We may have to follow Fairfax, but that's a great idea. That's a great idea.
Well, no one's followed up on that yet. but I think it would be a great idea to get those who are sitting home like myself. Of course, I'm not a medical person, but who want to volunteer some of their time, but don't want to get into a higher tax bracket.
Yeah.
But would love to get a tax break.
I really like the financial incentive in there. So that's your thinking. That's great. One more major area I'd like to have the panelists comment on before we get to specific questions, which Allison will walk us through. One of the big issues is, accessing quality education and accessing healthcare. And I know that you all have been working in these areas. What do you think it would be most important in ensuring that our communities who are challenged because of income or whatever high unemployment, low tax base, but their schools are not really up to speed? What would your advice be?
Well,
Gil.
I'll share a few thoughts. I think what is the best opportunity for success is understanding it's a pipeline, and that pipeline has to begin at pre-K early education initiatives. And I was very pleased to see the efforts that you all as legislators passed this past session. And with that pipeline, you know, it prepares people for post-secondary, post-high school opportunities. I mean, first of all, workforce, you know, for those who are interested in going into the trades, and secondly, in the higher education. Affordability and access have to be key to any process for higher education initiatives. I was involved with the State Council of Higher Education, SHEV, for a number of years, and
Yeah.
They did something called the Virginia Plan in
Yeah.
2016, and the Strategic Plan for Higher Education, and the key tenets were affordability and accessibility. And I think the Virginia Community College system plays a critical role. We have 23 across the Commonwealth, and one within 30 miles of every household.
Yep.
And that's a wonderful, affordable opportunity to get started in higher education, as well as the trades and vocational fields.
I've been a big fan of debt-free community college, and had proposed it. Then the governor, of course, embellished it and came up with a great proposal, but that money has been on hold because of the COVID-19 crises. But there are some key folks who believe that that is a very important thing to do for lots of reasons.
And I think there are a number of coalitions with the business community and a number of like-minded people who understand that it's also a workforce issue. You know, Virginia can't continue to be the best state for business without a properly prepared workforce.
And we do have some shortages in areas where a community college program could fill those shortages. So yeah, good point. Very good point. Anybody else like to comment? Jonathan, would you like to comment? And
Sure, it looked like Shirley wanted to jump in. I can.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
You know, I think that a lot of this is around how we prioritize. So budgets are moral documents. And is there money that if we put it into schooling, we would then not have to pay for some of the other things that we're paying for later on? I think that all of the research that's out there would say yes. And so, you know, we do have some challenges when it comes to resourcing schools as it relates to quality of education. School zones are a big challenge when it comes to disparities. How schools handle discipline, I think, is an area that builds into that pipeline that Gil talked about. So we could build a pipeline where young people have quality education and are able to build skills to be college or career ready. We also have a pipeline that there are some young people who are more likely to get pushed out. And so we really need to think about and work with our schools to make sure that students are finding a place of belonging, that teachers have professional development around trauma-informed practices, and that they can work effectively with their students to be able to de-escalate when there are things that come up. But in the same way, I think that when we look at our schools, in the same way we were talking about law enforcement professionals being asked to take on many more responsibilities than the traditional jobs, that's also true of our teachers. And so if we do think of these things as moral documents, we need to find the money and the political and social will to be able to invest now so that we don't have to pay later.
I could not agree more. One of the frustrations in the Senate is, some of you may know this, is when we get our fiscal impact statement, it's always focused on the impact of that program and not what we may be saving as a result of implementing the program. It's a very frustrating model. Shirley, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I just wanted to say, as we look to how we improve the schools and things, we talk about college. There are some kids who have no desire to attend college. And I think we need to look more at putting the technical and vocational training back into our schools, because this would allow someone who has decided that they don't want to go to college, when they get out of school at the 12th grade, then they have a skill. Maybe it's carpentry, maybe it's an electrical program, but where they can actually start working. And those have basically been taken out of our schools. And it leaves a lot of our kids in economically challenged areas behind. You know, so as a result, they end up finding jobs in a restaurant and a lawn care, but nowhere that would allow them to make a decent living where they could take care of a family.
Well, point well taken. I just want to say to the panelists who wanted to learn more about the diversion program in Houston and whether or not there were follow-up services for individuals who needed, you know, a mental health treatment program. I will say to that panelist, those are the kinds of questions we are going to have to find answers to, but we're looking at models, and I'm hoping we can give our local government some really good guidance in that area. And so I wanted to respond to that panelist. I am going to now turn our question.
Senator,
Yes,
may I just make one other point that I think
sure.
it's very important, you know, for all of us to consider, and that's the whole notion of health equity. And it impacts so much of our communities and probably law enforcement opportunities and et cetera. But there's this growing notion in the healthcare field called social determinants of health.
Yeah.
And that's where we live, work, play, and,
Yeah.
and it impacts the quality of our life and the length of our life. And we have communities in some urban neighborhoods where the lifespan is 20 years less in some of those very underserved neighborhoods simply because of those healthcare disparities. So it's a very costly venture. It's 20% of the national GDP, and it's something that, you know, if we were to think of the community on a wellness basis and preventative, it would save us a lot of money, just like education on the front end. You know, early ed saves us money on the back end. It's something I encourage us all to think about.
I thank you for that comment. I give a lot of my legislative attention to health issues. So I really appreciate that. And I'm hoping we can create medical zones of excellence so we can deal with some of those determinants that you just mentioned, Gil, but that it's a very, very, very important factor in giving everybody a decent head start. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn over to Allison Lawrence, who will, some questions came in advance, and she'll be fielding these questions and asking the panelists to respond. So we figured you guys might benefit from another voice, especially somebody who is an expert at this. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Allison. Allison, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Senator Favola, and all the distinguished panelists this evening. So we received a lot of great questions that were pre-submitted, and we also have a number of questions that have come in through the chat. So we'll get through as many of those as we can. But first, we're going to start with our pre-submitted questions. The first question has to do with education. Do you support teaching phonics instead of whole word for reading instruction in early elementary school?
May I respond to that?
Sure.
My child was in the first cohort when they started teaching whole language. And I would have preferred that phonics had been a part of that curriculum as well. I mean, the whole word language was okay, but if the children don't have a phonics underpinning, it's very hard for them to really decipher new words. So we ended up teaching phonics at home because he was only learning the whole word language in school. So as a parent, that's my particular view. I'm sure there are other viewpoints out there.
Anyone else like to add? Again, the question is, do you support teaching phonics instead of whole word for reading instruction in early elementary school?
This is Shirley. As a substitute teacher in Fairfax County, I would prefer having the phonics first, because I think it does help the kids a lot. And by the time they get in the second grade, they should be able to basically pronounce the words using the phonetics.
Yeah.
All right.
I will defer to the school teacher.
All right, moving along, keeping with the theme of education, this one's a little bit more catered to K through 12, and this is an interesting question, something I'm been very enjoyed reading about, and that is, has anyone on the panel investigated the plan forth by LeBron James in his hometown of Akron, Ohio? He has funded a root cause program addressing the needs of those who are impoverished. I would strongly recommend all the panelists read up on how he put this program together and the tangible benefits that have been achieved in less than 2 years. So would anyone like to comment on that? Are you all familiar with the mega basketball star LeBron James and how he's made an impact in his hometown of Akron? Anyone like to start?
I can't speak specifically to the details of his school other than to say thank you that he's willing to invest his personal funds and reputation and inspiration to children. But I do know there are a number of initiatives, including one in Norfolk called E3, and probably initiatives across the Commonwealth where people are trying best practices in that regard. There's a national program under purpose-built communities. So there are a number of these prototypes that are being explored, and I encourage all of them. I think all have a place in our communities.
I think that I would echo that. I think there are some really strong models out there, and some of what we're seeing with the outcomes from the school in the LeBron James is the issue that we talked about earlier, which is around funding. So there are a lot of resources that are going in. That's tremendous. I think it allows for smaller classroom sizes. It allows for a longer school day. It allows for enrichment and resources. There are some similar models that maybe don't have the same infusion of funding. The Harlem Children's Zone, I think, is a really important and inspiring example of you take school and really think about it with a holistic community-wide approach, looking at root causes, looking at the resources that families need. In addition, I think the Kalamazoo promise and the idea that funding is available to support students being able to go to college is another really great model that I know some localities in Virginia have adapted to try to provide like future centers around how students can be better prepared for college, especially first-generation college students. So there's some good models out there, and it's unfortunate that it takes a wealthy celebrity to provide the resources that only a select number are able to attend, and speaks to the fact that these are broader systemic issues that everyone should have the benefit of that type of opportunity and the resources that are at that school.
We're very grateful for his leadership and investment.
All right, thank you all. Moving on to a subject that we somewhat covered, and that is regarding civilian review boards and school resource officers, or SROs. So the question is, as real data provides, does it little, let's try to fix this a little bit better. Regarding school resource officers, as real data proves, it does little other than to enhance the school to prison pipeline, which disproportionately affects minorities and persons who are differently abled. Any comments on your views of SROs, school resource officers?
I would say I think that this is another case of maybe good intentions and not the best impact. So my colleagues and I at VCIC work with schools all across Virginia, and there are some SROs that are amazing, that have built deep, trusting relationships with students, so much so that students will go to the school resource officer and say, hey, you might want to be on the bus loop this afternoon, there's going to be a fight breaking out, and they can get ahead of those things and prevent or bring students in to be able to do mediation and things like that. I think the challenge is that that's not true 100% across the board. And so there are definitely examples in schools where this contributes to the school to prison pipeline, as the question named. I can think about an example in a school district where a school counselor at the elementary school level shared that she can think about 2 third graders, both male, one student in the class constantly gets up, walks around, doesn't stay at his seat, talks to others while the teacher's trying to teach, and the response from the teacher is, wow, he must be bored. Let's see if we can get him some enrichment work. That student happens to be white. Third grade boy gets up, walks around, makes a lot of noise, distracts his peers. Student is black, and the teacher's response is, you need to go to the main office. You need to go to the principal. And that escalates over time as that student gets older to potentially an interaction with an SRO. And so I think we really need to think about what that role is meant to do, and could the funds for school resource officers instead be used for more counselors, more crisis response, more trauma-informed training and resources within a school, and might that be that preventative side rather than the reactive side?
I would like to,
Go ahead.
I would like to add on to that, because one of the things that we found here in Fairfax, of course, was the distinction between the roles and responsibilities of the school resource officers and the administrative staff of the school. So they were basically being used to, in many instances, handle disciplinary problems where that was not the reason they were there. So how we corrected that was to rewrite the memorandum of understanding between the police department and the school, and clarify those roles and responsibilities. And I agree that if you look around the state of Virginia, for the school to prison pipeline, we are in the top 10%, top 10 of the list. So we need to work on that. But at the same time, I have to say last year, there were two incidents I'll give you. One of them was a student who actually had a gun in his mouth rather, to commit suicide. And it was a school resource officer was the one that saved that child's life by going to the home. Another was with a child getting ready to jump off a balcony, female. And it was a school resource officer that talked them down. But those aren't the incidents, that most people hear about. But I think we need to talk to some of the students about the relationships. And the school resources officers here are police officers, and they do carry a gun, but they've been in the school for some time, so they know these kids, because it's not like a one-year rotation. So I think, personally, I think they should be there, but I think we need to look at the different schools around the state. There's a model, the criminal justice, Department of Criminal Justice Services has a model for school resource officers. And I think that should be used for every school in the state that has school resource officers that explain the roles and responsibilities.
I think that's a good point. We have to sort of change the culture in our schools and what we expect of that resource officer. I mean, so much in the past has been, if the child was misbehaving, you'd call the school resource officer as opposed to figuring out why. And oftentimes it was a child who was struggling with maybe a learning disability or some other issue, and a counselor or another mechanism would have been more appropriate. A lot of schools have used peer-to-peer mediation. They've used other tools to ensure more harmony in the school setting. And I just think the culture needs to change. So Shirley, I agree with the comments that have been made by you and Jonathan about maybe we need to look at a different model if we're going to keep the school resource officer. But I'd like to not be wedded to these models that are bad for our kids and are not solving the problem.
All right, thank you all. The next question that was pre-submitted is Arlington and Northern Virginia specific, and it has to do with affordable housing. The question is, will adjusting the budget affect funds for affordable housing in Arlington or Northern Virginia? Inequity in housing and education should be considered when determining budget priorities. There should be no budget cuts in these areas.
Well, I guess I'm from Northern Virginia along with Shirley. I'll take the first crack unless you want to jump in, Shirley.
I'm not a budget person, so I
Okay.
can't. Okay, so I can't answer that. We have a county executive that handles and a board of supervisors. So I think I would be overstepping my role to try to respond to that.
Hard to imagine you would ever overstep your role. I, for one, think that the state, if at all possible, should restore the dollars that we have in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. This, prior to COVID-19, we had really robustly funded the Housing Trust Fund, and then the dollars were unallotted. And to the questioner's point, affordable housing is a really big deal. If you want a safe, inclusive community, folks need to be able to afford to live there. And the state emphasis, we could leverage state dollars and enable communities to really create safe and affordable places to live. I think affordable housing is sort of the next leg, if you will, to sustainability in the entire Commonwealth. Just like we invested in transportation, we're going to have to invest seriously in affordable housing.
Senator, let me also share, I think, one other leg on the table. We've talked about affordable housing, we've talked about public safety, education, and healthcare, but you know, any healthy neighborhood also has good workforce opportunities. You know, it allows, I've been an employer for 30 plus years, and you know, it builds self-esteem, it allows for financial independence. And, you know, a lot of good things happen when people have the confidence that they're working for a living. And I will also note on the call today, one of the listeners is one of the great Virginians, former Secretary of Education, Jim Dyke, who heads up the Virginia Chamber's workforce preparation effort. And it's programs like that that, you know, bring coalitions of a number of people together to find meaningful and gainful employment and all the good stuff that happens when people have a job and are making their own money. So I just wanted to say, I think that's another very important leg of building a very healthy neighborhood.
Well said. Well said.
That's a great transition into our next question that was pre-submitted, having to do with employment. So in the early 1980s, there were federally mandated affirmative action programs on the books that rewarded companies who hired people of color into their organizations. One was called a targeted jobs tax credit.
Yep.
Somewhere along the way in the early 2000s, this program was quietly removed without much fanfare. Has there been any consideration to bring back a revised form of this program to encourage the hiring of minorities?
I don't know. Jonathan, have you been monitoring this issue? I don't know if there's any action at the federal level, but you might be more aware than I am.
I'm not aware of legislative efforts to that effect. I'm not an expert in that specific area, so it may be I dismissed it. Yeah, I do think that there are some specific efforts that are in the same family of legislation. So I think some of the work that's been done in Virginia around small women minority-owned businesses certainly get at the same type of effort, which is to make sure that we're supporting our minority-owned businesses and making sure that money is being invested in communities that have historically not received the same level of support. There are some efforts like that. And then I would say that from our work with lots of businesses around Virginia, that nearly, you know, if you're a Fortune 500 company in Virginia, you have some sort of diversity council, supplier diversity effort, hiring and outreach effort. Now, the quality of them vary, but I think that there could be a lot more support, and maybe that's a legislative opportunity to resources and incentivize smaller businesses that don't have the resources of a Fortune 500 to be able to apply some of those same measures because they've been effective. Where they've been effective, they've actually helped to even improve their company's bottom lines.
And what Jonathan said is really punctuated now because of COVID-19. So many of our minority-owned businesses are smaller, not as well capitalized, and are often in the service industries, which have been devastated by people staying at home. So, you know, it's an obvious statement, but I do hope the General Assembly will consider as many resources targeting to save our small businesses as possible.
Well, the job growth is actually in the small business sector, and 70% of our small businesses are owned by minority entrepreneurs, which is an interesting statistic that I may have read from something the Virginia Chamber issued a report last year.
All right, we are coming up on our hour to conclude. So Senator, do you want to try to squeeze in one more question before closing remarks?
I think so.
Okay, all right. So let's take one from our Zoom chat that has been submitted. And this comes from Mr. Arthur Purvis. Forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong. And it ties into kind of what we've been talking about, right? Are there any thoughts on closing the minority student achievement gap?
Well, that's a great question. You know, I started my political career as a school activist, and this topic of the minority student achievement gap and closing it has been a topic for many years. And, you know, I'd like to go back to the model that we talked about earlier of it wasn't a charter school, it was a publicly funded school, but there were small class sizes. There was actually after school enrichment activities. There was tutoring after school. And students received, you know, the services they needed to succeed in their academic achievement. And I think that's how we have to look at our educational programs.
You know, I would only add that most studies suggest that 80% of brain development is by age 4, maybe earlier.
Yeah.
And, you know, for so many children who never see a classroom until age 5, they're already behind the curve.
Yes.
So I personally am just the strongest advocate possible of early education support.
And there's a lot of work, I think, right now building on that really helps us to understand that it's less and less of an achievement gap and more of an opportunity gap. It's not that students can't, it's that some are put on a pathway to access to opportunity and others are not. And so when we think about how many words is a child hearing before they even get to school, and how much reading is happening in the home, what does early pre-K look like, and quality pre-K? When we get into schools, are teachers equipped to engage in culturally relevant teaching practices? That's a big part of the African American History Commission that I have the honor of serving on. That one of the things we're looking at, it's not just about the curriculum and standards, important as they are to be accurate, and there are some inaccuracies that need to be addressed. It's also about making sure that teachers know how to effectively work with, connect with, and serve students from all racial, ethnic, cultural, socioeconomic backgrounds. It's looking at our discipline, it's looking at family engagement, school community partnerships. So we've seen some really significant outcomes from our work at BCIC when we've been able to work with districts or with intensive consulting and professional development to see some of those disparities and inequities get reduced. But we're playing catch up by the time we get to students in high school, and we're trying to close graduation rates, or we're trying to close discipline gaps. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area.
I completely agree. And I do hope maybe one day we'll have high quality universal access to preschool, or access to high quality preschool. That would be awesome. And, you know, one of the southern states, it's either Alabama or Mississippi, implemented an initiative where every child reads by the 3rd grade. And that actually made a difference in their graduation rate.
Well, that's certainly counter to using 3rd grade literacy as a precursor to prison construction. So I would support that.
Yeah, it's a different way, right? Let's do every child reading by third grade. That's a much better trajectory.
Okay,
Okay.
so Senator Favola.
Okay, well, I just want to thank our panelists. You were thoughtful. You gave us a great framework. You identified the issues well in a way that brought clarity and I think will help us find a pathway forward. I thank each and every one of you. And I thank you, Allison, for being a great moderator and ensuring that all this information will be fed into the entire caucus process. Jonathan, did you want to start off with concluding remarks or?
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'll just say one of the things I've said several times over the last few weeks. So today marks 1 month since the killing of George Floyd, and I think that's worth lifting up. In the last 4 weeks, our organization at VCIC has been overwhelmed with an unprecedented number of requests for support from Fortune 500 companies, schools, municipalities, all wanting help in crafting what their message and their response might be. That's really gratifying, that's really meaningful, and that's incredibly frustrating that it took this in order to create the urgency that we have right now. And so I hope that we can sustain the effort that exists right now so that we're not bouncing from crisis to crisis and back in this type of moment 6 months or a year from this time.
I would only conclude by it was a privilege joining two good friends, Jonathan and Shirley. I'm encouraged by a lot of what I've seen over the last few weeks, particularly led by the younger generation. But this past week, with the help of Jonathan, Shirley and I joined with the Asian Advisory Board, Asian American Advisory Board, Latino Advisory Board, and Women's Advisory Board. And on this past Tuesday, we published an op-ed in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And what we were attempting to do was inspire unity, that, you know, the various minority groups could come together, which are 1/3 of Virginia's population, and women are 51% of the population. If we can combine our efforts, we still have work to do together to get to know each other better and overcome some historical challenges. But there are grand opportunities of coalition. Jonathan spoke of it. I've watched his work for years and been very proud. Him and I participated in a year-long study of schools diversity programs just a year ago. There are a lot of great stuff that's going on in our communities that we can build upon that folks don't know about. And now that we're being led by the younger generation saying it's time for change, I really believe this is a window that we should all rally and support each other and indeed make some change.
Yes, it's a great comment. Great. Shirley?
Well, Senator, thank you very much for having me. And I would like to close with whatever I need to do to help, I'm available. And thank you very much. Oh my gosh,
you are such a community asset. We can claim her right here in Northern Virginia. Thank you so very much. And I am very hopeful. I think together we are definitely going to carve out some change. To the panelists whose questions we didn't answer, we will try our best to get back to you. Thank you all, and have a very a joyous evening, and let's keep up the momentum. We've got lots to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.